Hello, hello. I am sorry that I can't be at the Captain Summit in person. When I agreed to present, I wasn't quite sure where I was going to be at this time. Turns out that I'm an ocean away, so it wasn't really practical. But I'm really glad to be joining you virtually. I'm just going to start off with a bit of an introduction to neurodiversity and autistic advocacy, and then I will turn things over to the wonderful Dr. Robin Stamer to take everyone through some more practical, things around goal setting and how this could work in practice. So, um, uh, without further ado, traditionally, of course, autism has always been seen as a disorder that's characterized by certain deficits, and these deficits need to be treated, or even autism itself to be cured. This viewpoint is not only problematic insofar as it's very demoralizing and dehumanizing to be seen as deficient and disordered, but it also, I think, legitimizes discrimination against autistic people. Deficit views of autism are explicitly used to justify a number of uh, formal restrictions that, for example, prevent autistic people from serving in various jobs, piloting the military, etc., and also restrictions on mobility. I'm actually rather lucky to have gone into Australia. A lot of autistic people, actually end up being denied entry or actually deported from the country after they end up getting diagnosed. And all these formal restrictions, of course, exist on top of a lot of informal biases and stigma, informal discrimination against autistic and neurodivergent people. Um, and all of this stuff, this deficit model, this discrimination, etc., it's all coming from how non-autistic people have conceptualized and viewed autism and treated autistic people. Um, there has been a pronounced lack of, autistic involvement in the autism sphere until quite recently. In fact, to the best of my knowledge, it was only about 30 years ago in 1992 that three autistic people got together under their own power for the first time. Of course, it wasn't the first time that three autistic people had been in the same room, but previously, whenever that happened, they were brought there by neurotypical people for purposes that were set by neurotypical people, right? Whereas here, we've now got three autistic people coming together under their own power, and they actually founded the Autism Network International, the very first autism advocacy organization. And one of those three people, the next year, wrote this incredibly eloquent, moving piece called "Don't Mourn for Us." That was Jim Sinclair, and what Z wrote was sort of a rebuttal of this traditional metaphor for autism as being like a stranger who moves in to replace the perfect neurotypical child, and the goal is to like get this neurotypical child back and drive out the autism. And Sinclair was like, no, no, that is not the case. There is a real autistic child. This neurotypical child never existed, and this real autistic person needs to be accepted for who they are. There's many moving quotes in that piece, but one of them is, "This is what we know when you tell us of your fondest hopes and dreams for us, that your greatest wish is that one day we will cease to be, and strangers you can love will move in behind our faces." Autistic advocates also, took issue with this traditional way of viewing things through humor, through parody. So later in the 1990s, the Institute for the Study of the Neurologically Typical appeared on autistics.org. And this institute proclaimed that it was, interested in curing this tragic condition, neurotypical syndrome, a neurobiological disorder characterized by preoccupation with social concerns, delusions of superiority, and obsession with conformity. Now, of course, the autistic and neurodiversity advocacy movements are not, in fact, saying that neurotypical people are deficient or disordered. The point is that a lot of the things that autistic people are being accused of, having deficiencies in, it's not nearly as clear cut as that. It's not objective. You can actually twist it around and say, oh, actually, it's neurotypical people's fault. More on that in a bit. Um, but this growing advocacy movement needed a name, and some people on the independent living on the autistic spectrum listserv came up with one, the term neurodiversity. The idea, biodiversity is good for life in general, so why couldn't neurodiversity, diversity of minds and brains, be something that we should value as a society? Notice here that we're no longer talking about just autism, and specifically, we're talking about diversity of minds and brains in general. So that could be ADHD, dyslexia, it could be any number of things if people find these ideas helpful to them. So we have a neurodiversity advocacy movement now. But what exactly is it? It's kind of tricky because there's a lot of conflicting information out there, subtle differences in perspectives, as well as outright misinformation. A lot of definitions of neurodiversity come from people outside the movement trying to make sense of it. And some of them are not correct or are more radical than what neurodiversity advocates actually believe for the most part. But there are some core themes to this neurodiversity movement. So, of course, diversity of minds and brains can be good. May not always be good, but humans certainly shouldn't aspire to all be carbon copies of one another. Moreover, those people who do have atypical brains in a disadvantaged way, neurodivergent people, face power dynamics, oppression, stigma in much the same way as other marginalized and minoritized groups throughout history, groups oppressed based on their race, their gender, whatever. Of course, with neurodivergence and disability, there's additional, more complex things, but that doesn't take away from the fact that there definitely is straightforward traditional oppression, straightforward traditional stigma, and power subordination and all of that. And an additional point from neurodiversity advocacy is that we should accept people as they are and support their thriving as they are without trying to, sort of change who somebody is fundamentally, cure them or normalize them, except, for certain co-occurring conditions. So, for example, neurodiversity advocates would definitely say, oh, yeah, if you are getting some kind of dementia, some kind of neurodegenerative thing, then yeah, if there's a way to medically treat that, that would be great. But leave my autism alone is, for example. And this very different viewpoint from the traditional one regarding what interventions should be definitely led to some disputes. So, an early example of that came about 20 years ago when the Supreme Court of Canada was considering a case on whether or not the government was obliged to fund ABA services for autistic children, or whether the government was merely, free to provide the service if it so desired and pleased. And for the most part, the debate was based on technical legal considerations, questions of whether the treatment was or was not effective in pursuing these traditional normalization goals, and so on. But there was one intervener in the case, Michelle Dawson, who is autistic. And Dawson, expressed much more fundamental concerns, first of all, over whether ABA, especially as practiced 20 years ago, could actually be causing some harms, as well as the question of representation and power, pointing out that autistic people had been excluded from any position of power oversight over these sorts of ABA interventions at the time, and questioning the legitimacy of that, of completely excluding, people from the community that was receiving the intervention in making decisions about the intervention itself. And that is, of course, core to what neurodiversity advocates are seeking, the slogan, nothing about us without us, that autistic and neurodivergent people need to have a say in our lives. And so that say is one that's taking us away from this traditional understanding of disability, what we call the medical model of disability. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with that term. The idea that disability and challenges are medically rooted within the individual themselves, and the solution to the challenges is to change the person to make them a typical able-bodied person. One alternative to this view is the social model of disability, which hopefully many of you are already familiar with. This model makes a technical distinction between impairment, which we might actually better call just individual differences, because some differences are actually strengths and some are weaknesses. So we have individual differences that are located within the person, and those can be impairments, but that doesn't directly cause challenges and disability. It's society's failure to accommodate and include impairments that leads to disability, and therefore we have to reform society. So a classic example of this, of course, is universal design as far as physical accessibility is concerned. So for example, if there aren't wheelchair ramps, then if we just have staircases everywhere, and then that is not accessible. This is also inaccessible. This is a ramp, yes, but it is not a very good ramp. You see, we have a problem here because the flow of traffic up the stairs is parallel to the flow of traffic up the ramps, so you could have some collisions there, and we've got these tight corners with no actual railing and a fairly steep drop off to the sides. So this is not actually a very accessible ramp. It looks pretty and makes, able-bodied people feel good because, it's like accessible and inclusive, but it turns out not to be. And this is why, there's nothing about us without us. This need to actually involve disabled and neurodivergent people in decision-making is so crucial. So to give a more autism relevant example, let's say that we've got this traditional approach here, and we're saying that somebody called Mateo has some social deficits. He's not initiating interaction with his peers. He's very isolated. But should we be blaming that on Mateo? First of all, what does he want? Does he actually want to hang out with the people in his class, or maybe there's another group of people that he finds he has more in common with? Maybe he would actually appreciate an opportunity to do so. Of course, we can't deny people a right to be included along typical peers, but a right is different from a duty, and maybe he would rather have some social connections elsewhere. What about the context here? Is it very noisy and overwhelming in the environments where Mateo is interacting with these peers? Is he having to enter and exit groups and deal with all kinds of complicated social dynamics there? Maybe a better environment where there's less sort of overwhelming demands would make it easier for him to interact with people if he is in fact interested in interacting with those people. And also, are Mateo's social deficits actually the problem? Maybe it's actually the neurotypical peers that are the problem. Maybe they are biased or prejudiced against the way that Mateo interacts with people, at least implicitly. Perhaps there's even some explicit bullying that's going on. That's very plausible, actually, because there's studies that show that just showing people short video clips of autistic individuals leads to some negative judgments being made against the autistic people. But these judgments don't happen when you're just looking at a transcript of what the autistic person is saying. So the autistic person is not doing anything wrong as far as the substance of what they're saying and doing. There's just some subtle quirkiness in the video of them in the way that they're appearing that is leading people to judge them negatively. So this is where the social model is coming from, the need to reform society. Now, in practice, the social model may sometimes be coming off a bit strong. Sometimes there may be challenges that a person is likely to encounter in pretty much any societal context, and maybe a way of like teaching them some useful skills without fundamentally trying to change who they are or reject who they are, tell them there's something wrong with them, is possible. And so maybe we want to adopt sort of an interactionist middle ground, which is very consistent with the neurodiversity movement, which, as I mentioned before, is only supposed to apply to like autism itself and not co-occurring things and so on. So there is some middle ground here, but certainly a much greater need to be focusing on the social realm, on society, on the context around neurodivergent people than has been the case historically. So at this point, I will turn things over to Dr. Robin Stamer, who can tell us more about how we might be doing that.